She stepped off that train with nothing but a torn dress, a bruised face, and a secret that could destroy the most powerful man in America. Every person on that platform stared. The sheriff, the station master, the women clutching their coats against the blizzard wind. They all saw it. The way her eyes moved before her feet did, scanning, measuring, like an animal checking for predators before stepping into the open. Elias Crow saw it too, and in that single frozen moment, before either of them spoke a single word, his entire life changed. This is her story. This is his story. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand why some secrets are worth dying for. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The blizzard came down from the north like it had a grudge. By the time the 415 out of Denver was scheduled to pull into Harlan's Creek, the temperature had dropped so fast that the station master, a barrel-chested man named Gerald Potts, could feel the cold working its way through his coat, through his flannel shirt, through the fat he'd spent 30 years building up as insulation. He stood on the platform anyway, lantern in hand, squinting into the white nothing beyond the tracks. Behind him, tucked under the narrow overhang of the station building, stood Elias Crow. Elias wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same pine he used to build fence posts. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with wind and altitude and 14-hour workdays. He had a scar along his left jaw from a fence wire accident 6 years back, and he never once thought to explain it to anyone who asked. He was not happy to be standing on this platform. He was not happy about any of this. "She'll be on it," said Potts, without turning around, as if he'd read Elias's mind through the back of his skull. Mabel Hutchins saw the telegram herself. "Woman's name is Rosalind Hart. Chicago, originally," the agency said. "I know what the agency said." "Then why do you look like you're about to walk into your own funeral?" Elias didn't answer that, partly because he didn't have a good answer, partly because the question hit closer than he liked. The truth, the honest, uncomfortable truth, was that he hadn't wanted to do this. Writing to the agency had been his neighbor Dorothea Crane's idea, a woman who had appointed herself the unofficial manager of Elias's personal life ever since his mother passed 3 winters ago. "You can't run that homestead alone forever, Elias. You need help. Someone to share the work, someone to cook and keep the fire, and maybe, if you're lucky, someone to talk to when the nights get long." He'd resisted for 2 years. Then last March, a freak late-season freeze had killed half his livestock and cracked the water pipe on the north side of the cabin, and he'd spent 4 days alone in that cabin eating hardtack and listening to the wind tear at the roof. And somewhere around the 3rd day, he'd thought, fine, send the letter. He'd sent the letter. He did not feel good about it. The train announced itself before it appeared, a low metallic groan that built itself into something you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Then the headlamp came punching through the white curtain of snow, and the 415 rolled into Harlan's Creek 12 minutes late, which for January was practically a miracle. Potts held his lantern up. 3 passengers descended. First came the Alderman brothers, 2 miners from the camp up at Ridgeline, back from a supply run to Denver. They clattered down the steps in heavy boots, arguing about something, and disappeared toward the saloon without looking at anyone. Then the train went quiet. Elias waited. Potts stepped forward and called up to the conductor. "Anyone else?" The conductor, a thin man in a blue uniform, leaned out from the door. "One more. She's—" He looked back over his shoulder. "Ma'am, this is your stop." There was a pause. A long one. Long enough that Elias found himself shifting his weight, long enough that the cold found its way under his collar, long enough that he almost decided she wasn't coming. And then she appeared in the doorway. The first thing he noticed was the dress. It was velvet, a deep burgundy color, the kind of dress you wore to a dinner party or an opera, not to a train platform in the middle of a Rocky Mountain blizzard. It was also torn, a clean rip along the left shoulder seam, pinned together with what looked like a common safety pin. The hem was dirty. The buttons at the collar were mismatched, as if someone had replaced them in a hurry. The second thing he noticed was the bag. One bag. A single worn leather traveling bag that she gripped with both hands, held against her chest like a shield. The third thing he noticed was the bruise. It sat just below her right cheekbone, faded to yellow and green at the edges, which meant it was several days old. Whoever had put it there had done it before she got on the train. She stepped down onto the platform, and her boot heel caught the edge of the bottom step, and she stumbled, grabbing the railing, and caught herself before she fell. No one rushed to help her. Potts was already writing something in his log. The conductor was already pulling the door shut. Only Elias moved. He crossed the platform in 4 steps and reached out. Not grabbing, just placing his hand near her elbow in case she needed it. She didn't take it. She straightened up, squared her shoulders, and looked at him. Her eyes were gray. Not the washed-out gray of dirty ice, but something sharper, darker. The eyes of a person who had spent recent time being very, very careful about what they let show. "Mr. Crow?" she said. "That's right. I'm Rosalind Hart." She shifted the bag in her arms. Her knuckles were white. "I apologize for the delay. There was some difficulty boarding in Denver." "Difficulty?" "Yes." He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. He noticed in the silence that her eyes moved. Not to him, not to the platform, but past him. To the end of the platform. To the far side of the train. To the space between the station building and the tracks. A quick sweep. Practiced. Like she'd done it 1,000 times before without even knowing she was doing it. "Where's the rest of your luggage?" he asked. Something moved across her face, too fast to name. "This is everything I have." That was a lie. Not an obvious one. She didn't look away, didn't fidget, kept her voice steady. But it was still a lie, and Elias had spent enough years reading weather and animals and broken fence lines to know when something wasn't adding up. He let it go. For now. "Wagon's out front," he said. "We should move before this gets worse." She nodded and followed him, and he noticed she walked close to the station wall, away from the open platform. He noticed she looked back once, just before they rounded the corner. A fast, sharp glance toward the far end of the tracks, where the train was already beginning to pull away. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. Or maybe she just hadn't found it yet. The town of Harlan's Creek had exactly 1 church, 2 saloons, a general store, a doctor's office that doubled as a barbershop on Saturdays, and approximately 240 people who had opinions about everyone else's business. By the time Elias's wagon had traveled half a block from the station, Rosalind Hart had already been observed by at least 11 of them. He could feel it, the eyes behind windows, the woman on the mercantile steps who stopped sweeping to watch, the 2 men outside the feed store who stopped their conversation and said nothing, which was almost louder than if they'd shouted. Rosalind sat beside him on the wagon bench, her bag on her lap, her back straight. She was shivering. She had to be in that dress, but she wasn't making a sound about it. "There's a blanket behind the seat," Elias said. She reached back without a word and pulled it around her shoulders. "Thank you." They rode in silence for a block. The snow was coming down harder now, and the horses, a pair of buckskins named Abner and Lou, were leaning into it with their heads down, ears flat. "How far is the homestead?" she asked. "About 7 miles, 40 minutes in good weather. Tonight, probably an hour." She absorbed this. "Is it always like this? In January?" "Like what?" She gestured vaguely at the sky, the snow, the general hostility of the climate. "Sometimes worse," he said. "You can turn back if you want. Train'll come back through in 3 days." He didn't mean it as a threat. It came out rougher than he intended, which was a habit he'd never fully managed to break. He waited for her to take offense. She didn't. She just looked at him with those sharp gray eyes and said very quietly, "I can't go back." He glanced at her. She wasn't being dramatic. There was no performance in it. Just a plain statement of fact, the way you'd say the fence is down or the river's flooding, a thing that was simply true. "All right," he said. "Mr. Crow." She stopped. "Try it again." "Elias, I know this isn't what either of us expected. I know I don't look the way the agency probably described me. I know this whole situation is—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't strange, but I will work. I will contribute. I am not afraid of hard work. I just need—" She exhaled, and it came out shaky at the edges. "I need somewhere that isn't— I need to not go back, please. The please did something to him he didn't expect. It was so stripped of pride, like it cost her something real to say it. He looked straight ahead at the horses, at the snow, at the 7 miles of frozen road between here and home. I wasn't going to send you back, he said finally. I don't operate that way. She didn't say anything to that, but from the corner of his eye he saw her exhale slowly, and some tension in her shoulders dropped about half an inch. They rode the rest of the way in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't an angry one either. It was the silence of two people who had just agreed to something neither of them fully understood yet. They were married that afternoon. It wasn't planned, or rather, it was planned in the vague procedural way that Elias had organized it weeks ago when the agency confirmed her arrival. A brief ceremony with Pastor Hollis, witnessed by Dorothea Crane and her husband Frank, followed by whatever awkward dinner Elias could manage to put together with what he had in the larder. What he hadn't planned for was the way it actually felt. Hollis kept it short. The parlor of his small house smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool, and there was a water stain on the ceiling above his desk that Elias found himself staring at during the vows. Dorothea cried, which was predictable. Frank shook Elias's hand afterward with both of his, which was the most emotion Frank Crane had displayed since their barn roof collapsed in the spring. Rosalind said her vows in a clear, even voice. No trembling, no hesitation. If she was terrified, she was very good at not showing it. Afterward, when they were back in the wagon, she said, I want you to know something. All right, I will be honest with you about what I can be honest about. But there are things She paused, choosing the words. There are things I can't tell you yet. Not because I don't want to, but because it's safer if you don't know, for now. Elias thought about this. The bruise, the single bag, the way she looked over her shoulder. Are you in danger? He asked. She was quiet for 3 seconds. I might be. I don't think it will follow me here, but I don't know for certain. He appreciated that she didn't lie about the uncertainty. Most people would have. If something comes, he said, I'd rather know about it ahead of time than be surprised. I understand. I'm not saying that to frighten you. I'm saying it because surprised is how men get killed. She turned to look at him then. A full, direct look, the kind that measured something. You're not afraid, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm afraid of plenty of things, he said. Stupid things mostly. Running out of feed in February. The axle on this wagon. Losing the north pasture. He paused. Men who come looking for trouble, I'm less afraid of. I've handled that before. She held his gaze for another moment, then looked back at the road. I'll tell you what I can, she said quietly. When I can. That'll do, he said. The homestead sat at the base of a long slope, backed against a stand of ponderosa pine that served as a windbreak in the worst weather. The cabin was solid. Not beautiful, not large, but solid, built with the kind of obsessive structural integrity that only came from a man who'd spent 2 winters learning the hard way what happened when a building failed at 40 below. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen corner with a cast-iron stove, 2 smaller rooms in the back, and a loft above the main room that Elias had been using for storage. Out back, a barn, a root cellar, a smokehouse that needed re-chinked, and a chicken coop that needed new wire on the south side. He gave her the tour quickly, not because he didn't care, but because he'd never been good at knowing what to explain. He pointed at things, named them, told her where the firewood was, where the water pump was, where the extra blankets were kept. She walked through each space with her bag still in her hands, looking at everything, saying very little. When they got to the back bedroom, her room, which he'd cleaned out 2 days ago, with the specific misery of a man who didn't know what a woman expected to find in a room, she stood in the doorway and looked at the narrow bed, the single window, the hooks on the wall where she could hang things. It's warm, she said. Stove in the main room heats through. Gets cold toward morning sometimes if the fire dies down. I'll show you how to bank it before you sleep. She nodded. Then, almost like she couldn't help it, she went to the window. She didn't part the curtain all the way. Just a small gap, enough to see the yard, the road, the long open slope above the tree line. She stood there for a moment. Then she let the curtain fall and turned around. Thank you, she said, for not asking too many questions today. I've got plenty of questions, he said, I'm just not asking them yet. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Fair enough, she said. The first 2 weeks were awkward in the way that most honest things are awkward. She didn't know how to run a wood stove. She burned the first 2 batches of biscuits badly enough that even the dogs, a pair of mixed-breed mutts named Harris and Clementine, showed no interest. She'd never cleaned a chimney, didn't know how to read weather by cloud patterns, and had absolutely no practical experience with livestock beyond an abstract awareness that cows existed. But she learned. That was the thing. She didn't complain about not knowing. She just watched and asked specific questions. Not how does this work, but what do I do first when the temperature drops below 0? And then she did it. Made mistakes, corrected them, did it again better. By the end of the 2nd week, she had the biscuits figured out and was already pestering Elias about the logic of where he stored the root vegetables, which, she pointed out, made no sense given the way frost moved through the cellar floor. She was right. He'd been losing potatoes unnecessarily for years. He rearranged the shelves and didn't mention that she'd been right about it. She mentioned it for him, cheerfully, at dinner. You don't have to sound so pleased about it, he said. I really do, she said. It's the first useful thing I've done here that didn't involve breaking something first. He didn't say anything to that, but he was looking at his plate when he said it, which meant she didn't see his expression, which was probably for the best. There were other things, though. Things that didn't fit. She woke up every night. He knew because he was a light sleeper. Always had been, since childhood. And he heard it. The quiet creak of her bed, the soft footsteps, the faint brush of curtain fabric. Every single night. Sometimes once, sometimes twice. She'd check the window, stand there for a minute or two, then go back to bed. She kept a small notebook in her coat pocket. Brown leather cover, the kind you could buy at any general store. She wrote in it regularly, at the kitchen table in the early morning, by the fire at night. She wrote quickly, with her arm curved around the page the way school children did when they didn't want anyone to see their answers. He never asked about it. He wanted to. He didn't. She also did something else, something subtler, that he only put together gradually. She remembered everything. Not just practical things. She remembered exact words from conversations days later, referenced them accurately. She noticed patterns. Once, watching him work on the fence line, she pointed out, without being asked, that the posts on the east side were listing at a consistent angle that suggested the soil composition was different there, and that he might want to adjust the depth before the spring thaw. She said it like it was obvious, like she'd been cataloging details the way most people breathed. He found himself wondering, not for the first time, who exactly had trained her to be this way, and for what purpose. The wolf attack came on a Thursday, 3 weeks into February. Elias had ridden out before dawn to check the condition of the creek access on the south pasture. It was something he needed to do in person, and it took most of the day. He left before Rosalind was awake, which he told himself was practical and not an act of avoidance, though it might have been a little of both. He was 5 miles out when the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and he decided to push back faster than planned. He heard the dogs before he saw the homestead. Harris and Clementine were going absolutely berserk, a sound that was less barking and more screaming, and then he heard something underneath it, something low and multiple, a sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck because it was one of those sounds that the body understood before the brain caught up. He pushed Abner to a gallop. When he came around the tree line and the homestead came into view, what he saw stopped his heart for a solid 2 seconds. There were 4 wolves at the edge of the yard. Big ones. Mountain wolves, the kind that came down when the elk were scarce and the cold got bad enough. They'd gotten into the chicken coop, the south wire, the one he'd been meaning to fix. And now they were pushing the situation, trying to work around to the barn. Standing between them and the barn door was Rosalind. She had the shotgun. His shotgun, which he kept loaded and racked by the back door, which she would have had to cross the entire main room and then the kitchen to reach. She was holding it correctly, stock against her shoulder, not held from the hip like someone who'd only seen it done wrong. Her feet were planted in the snow about shoulder width apart, and she was not moving. One of the wolves had peeled away from the others and was working a slow circle to her right. She tracked it, moved her feet to keep her angle, kept the other 3 in her peripheral view. "Hey," she said. Just that. Like she was talking to a dog that had gotten into the garbage. The circling wolf stopped. She fired. The shot went wide, deliberately, he realized later, aimed at the snow to the wolf's left, and the sound exploded across the yard and all 4 wolves bolted. They didn't come back. She stood there for another full minute, holding the gun, watching the tree line. Then she unloaded the second shell, set the safety, and turned around. She saw Elias sitting on his horse at the edge of the yard and stopped. "The south wire," she said. Her voice was completely steady, but her hands were shaking. "I saw them working at it this morning, but I thought I was going to tell you when you got back." "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." "The animals?" "Lost 3 chickens before I got out there. The rest are in the barn. I got them in before the wolves got to the coop door." He dismounted, walked across the yard, took the shotgun from her, and reloaded it without saying anything. Then he went and checked the barn, checked the chicken coop, checked the perimeter. When he came back around, she was still standing in the yard. The shaking in her hands had stopped, but she looked exhausted in the particular way that came not from physical exertion, but from sustained, controlled fear. "You knew how to do that," he said. "My father taught me to shoot," she said, "when I was a girl." He looked at her. "That was more than just knowing how to shoot. You kept 4 wolves at distance for how long?" She glanced at the sky, calculating. "Maybe 20 minutes. And you kept them at distance. That's not the same thing as firing a gun." He waited. "Where'd you learn to do that?" She was quiet. "Rosalind, I can't explain that right now." He looked at her for a long moment. The yard. The tracks in the snow where the wolves had been. The tree line they'd disappeared into. "Come inside," he said. "You're frozen." She followed him in. He put more wood on the fire and made coffee, the kind of task that gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through what he'd seen. She sat at the kitchen table in her coat and boots and wrapped both hands around the mug when he set it in front of her. He sat down across from her. "I'm not asking you to explain everything," he said. "I'm not doing that. But I found something today." She went very still. "Your coat," he said. "When I came in, it was on the floor by the back door. Fell off the hook. The notebook fell out." He put it on the table between them. "I didn't read it. I saw one line before I could stop myself. One line." She looked at the notebook. Her face had gone pale. "They will find me eventually," he said. The fire popped. Outside, the wind picked up again, pushing snow against the window pane. She didn't deny it, didn't deflect. She just looked at him across the table with those gray eyes, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, he saw something in her face that looked like the beginning of surrender. Not to him, to the exhaustion of carrying it alone. "Elias," she said quietly, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that once I tell you, you can't pretend you don't know, and that might put you in a position you don't want to be in." "I'm already in a position," he said. "I've been in it since you stepped off that train. I'd rather know what it is than keep pretending I don't." She set both hands flat on the table, looked at him. "All right," she said, and began to talk. She talked for nearly an hour, not all of it. He understood that. There were gaps, places where she chose her words too carefully, things she stopped before finishing. But enough. Enough to understand the shape of it. A man named Vincent Lockwood. Railroad money. Something she'd seen in the accounts. Discovered was the word she used. Records that shouldn't have existed. Payments that connected to things she wouldn't specify yet. Documents she'd copied before she ran. "How long ago?" he asked. 4 months? "And you've been running for 4 months?" "Yes." He thought about the bruise. "What happened in Denver?" Her hands tightened slightly on the table. "Someone found me. I got away. It was close." He exhaled through his nose. Thought about the 7 miles between the homestead and town. Thought about the road, which only had one real access point in winter. Thought about the fact that he owned exactly 3 guns, the shotgun, a rifle, and a pistol he hadn't cleaned in 2 years. And that he was one man. "You think they followed you here?" "I don't know," she said. "I was careful. I used a different name to book passage as far as Pueblo, and then I was very careful, but I don't know for certain that I wasn't seen." "Lockwood," he said. "I've heard that name. Railroad man." "He's more than a railroad man," she said. There was something in her voice when she said it, something flat and careful, like pressing down on something that wanted to rise. His reach is very wide, Elias. Judges, politicians. There are lawmen in this territory who take his money. Elias sat back. Let that settle. You're saying I can't just go to the marshal. I'm saying, she said carefully, that I don't know which men I can trust, and neither would you. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. No, he said. It isn't. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned, the wind pushed at the walls of the cabin, finding all the places where the chinking had gone soft, and the cabin held. There's more, she said after a while. I figured, he said. Not tonight, she said. I can't. Not tonight. There's more, but I can't get through all of it tonight. He looked at her. The exhaustion in her face was real now, the kind you couldn't fake. All right, he said. Go sleep. She stood, picked up her coat, her notebook, stood there for a moment with her hand on the back of the chair. Thank you, she said, for not being angry. I'm not angry, he said honestly. I'm setting it aside. There's a difference. She almost smiled at that. Good night, Elias. Good night. He sat at the table for a long time after she went to bed, listening to the blizzard work itself against the walls, thinking about a man named Lockwood, thinking about what reach meant when it came from a woman who'd spent 4 months running, thinking about the way she'd stood in that yard with a shotgun and 4 wolves and held her ground. Outside, the mountains were indifferent to all of it, as they always were. Snow fell. Temperature dropped. The ponderosas bent slightly in the wind and held. The fire burned. Elias fetted another log and didn't sleep until almost 3 in the morning. When he finally did, he slept with the rifle leaned against the wall beside his bed, just in case. The morning after she told him about Lockwood, Elias woke up and did what he always did. Fed the horses, broke the ice on the water trough, split enough wood to get through the day. The routine was deliberate, not because he was pretending nothing had changed. It had, obviously, in ways he hadn't fully measured yet, but because the animals still needed feeding regardless of what he was carrying around in his head, and there was something in that fact he found useful. Rosalind was already up when he came back inside. She'd made coffee, real coffee, not the watered-down version she'd been producing her first week, and she was standing at the kitchen window with a mug in both hands, looking out at the yard the way she always did. Checking. Measuring. He hung his coat and sat down and poured himself a cup without saying anything. She didn't say anything either. They drank their coffee in a silence that was different from the early silences, less careful, somehow, like 2 people who'd put their cards on the table and were now simply figuring out what game they were playing. I owe you more of an explanation, she said finally. You owe me whatever you're ready to give, he said. Not more than that. She turned from the window. That's either very generous or you're not actually as curious as I think you are. I'm curious, he said. I'm just not stupid enough to push before you're ready. Half-truths are worse than no truth at all. She considered this, sat down across from him, wrapped both hands around her mug the way she always did when she was thinking, like the warmth helped something work better. I worked for Lockwood Industries for 3 years, she said, as an accounts manager, specifically for the Western Expansion Division, the rail lines being pushed through Colorado and the territories. She paused. I was good at my job. That was the problem eventually. I noticed things other people either didn't notice or decided not to. What kind of things? Payments that didn't match any contracted services. Ledger entries that referenced project names that didn't exist in any official documentation. Transfers to accounts I couldn't trace through normal channels. She set her mug down. I thought at first it was accounting errors, sloppy bookkeeping. It happens in companies that grow too fast. So I started cross-referencing, trying to find the discrepancies and correct them. Her jaw tightened slightly. The more I looked, the worse it got. He waited. There were land acquisition records, she said, for parcels that had been cleared, families removed. I found a paper trail linking payments to men who weren't contractors or surveyors, men whose names appeared in territorial crime reports. She looked at him directly. I found payments made within weeks of incidents. A farmhouse fire in Wyoming that killed 2 people. a witness in a land dispute who disappeared before he could testify. These weren't coincidences, Elias. The timing was too precise. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove ticking and the distant sound of wind working through the pine trees outside. "You copied the records," he said. "Everything I could get my hands on, over about 3 months, without letting anyone see what I was doing." Something crossed her face. Not pride exactly, but the particular satisfaction of having done something difficult and doing it correctly. "I kept working normally, kept my numbers clean, gave Lockwood's people no reason to look at me." She paused. "I thought I had more time. I was trying to figure out who I could bring the documents to, who was actually clean." "What happened?" She was quiet for a moment. "Someone noticed. I still don't know who. I came back to my office one evening to retrieve something I'd left, and there were 2 men going through my desk." A flat, careful exhale. "I didn't go in. I walked past the door like I'd taken a wrong turn, went down the back stairs and didn't go back." "You ran that night." "I ran that night, with what I had in my office bag and what I could pull from my apartment in about 15 minutes. She touched the strap of the leather bag on the chair beside her, an unconscious gesture, like checking that it was still there. "I've been moving since then, 4 months. He thought about the bruise again. "Denver," she'd said. "Someone found her." "The documents," he said. "They're in the bag." She didn't confirm it. She also didn't deny it. "I'm not going to take them," he said, slightly irritated. "I'm asking because I need to understand what we're dealing with." "Yes," she said. "The copies are in the bag, wrapped in oilcloth." She paused. "They're the only copies. Lockwood's people will have destroyed the originals by now. If something happens to what I have—" She stopped. "Nothing happens to it," he said. It came out like he was talking about a fence post or a water pipe, a practical matter, something that simply needed to be handled. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Making terrible situations sound like minor inconveniences." "Panicking doesn't fix anything," he said. "I've never once panicked my way out of a problem." She almost laughed at that. Not quite. It didn't fully form, but close enough that he saw it happen and then get swallowed back. "Fair enough," she said. They finished their coffee. He went back outside. She started on the breakfast. It was an ordinary morning by most measures, except that they were both carrying the weight of what they'd said, and neither of them mentioned it again for 2 days, which was its own kind of management strategy. Life had a way of filling the space regardless. March came in sideways and mean. The snow didn't quit, and there was a week where the temperature dropped low enough that Elias had to run a heat lamp in the barn to keep the water from freezing in the troughs, and that meant sleeping light every 3 hours to check on it, which left them both ragged. Rosalind took the 2 a.m. check without being asked, simply appeared in the kitchen at the right time in her coat and boots, and went out to the barn and came back and went back to bed. He noticed this, filed it away. She was getting better at the physical work, though better was relative. Her hands were a disaster, cracked and calloused in ways she bore without complaint, but which he caught her examining sometimes with a kind of rueful bewilderment, like they belonged to someone else. He brought back a tin of lanolin salve from town during a supply run and left it on the kitchen table without comment. She used it without comment. It seemed to work. What she was naturally good at, it turned out, was the thinking work, the planning, the way she could look at a problem, the cellar drainage, the feed calculation for getting through to April, the structural weakness he'd been ignoring on the east side of the barn, and immediately start running variables in her head. She'd come to him 3 days after he'd mentioned the east barn wall while he was replacing a hinge on the barn door, and she'd sketched something on a piece of paper. "Diagonal brace here and here," she said, pointing. "The load's distributing wrong because the vertical posts don't have enough lateral support. You fix those 2 points, the whole wall stabilizes." He looked at the sketch, looked at the wall. She was right. "Where'd you learn structural engineering?" he asked. "I didn't. I just looked at where it was failing and worked backward." She folded the paper. "My father was an architect. I grew up watching him look at buildings." She said this in the past tense in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. He didn't ask, but these were the pieces he was accumulating, slowly, the way you built a picture from separate details you found over time. Her father was an architect. She'd learned to shoot. She understood accounts the way most people understood language, not as something learned, but as something native. She had the particular wariness of someone who had spent time in environments where being caught off guard had consequences. None of it added up to a simple story, and he'd stopped expecting one. The notebook was a different matter. He'd told her the truth. He'd seen one line before he could stop himself, and he hadn't read further. But he was aware of the notebook in the way you became aware of things you weren't supposed to look at. She wrote in it most mornings and sometimes at night, always with that curved, protective posture, and occasionally he'd come into the kitchen and she'd close it and set it aside with a casualness that was slightly too deliberate. One evening in mid-March, he came in from the barn to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the notebook open, staring at what she'd written with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. The look of someone who'd done the math and didn't like where it came out. She closed the notebook when she heard him, but slowly. Not hiding it, just closing it. There was a difference. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes." She set the notebook aside. "I was trying to figure out, I was mapping what I know against what I've heard about federal prosecution. What evidence would actually be admissible? What a federal attorney would need versus what I have." He sat down. And what I have is substantial, but it's not complete. The account records establish the payments, and the timing is damning. But payments alone don't prove intent. They can be explained away by a good defense attorney as irregular business arrangements. She rubbed her forehead with 2 fingers, a gesture she made when she was working through something frustrating. "I need someone who can testify to what the payments were for. An inside witness. Someone who knew the purpose, not just the mechanics. Do you have anyone like that?" She was quiet for a beat too long. "There's a man," she said carefully. "Another accountant who worked for Lockwood's Eastern operations. Nathaniel Briggs. He was in a different division, but our records overlapped in places. I've seen enough of his work to know that he has access to the Eastern ledgers, the ones that would connect Lockwood's money to specific operations that I can only infer from my records." She paused. "If Briggs has what I think he has, and if he'd be willing to testify, it would be the difference between an investigation that stalls out and one that actually lands. You know where he is?" "Somewhere in the West. He left Lockwood Industries 6 months before I did. He could be anywhere between Kansas City and Sacramento." She looked at the notebook. "He might not even know what he has. He might not be willing to come forward even if he does." "One problem at a time," Elias said. She looked at him. "I've been trying to find him for months. How is that one problem at a time? Right now, the problem is getting through to spring without anyone finding this place. You can't find Briggs from a shallow grave." He said it bluntly, not cruelly. "So, one problem at a time." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "You're right." She exhaled slowly. "I know you're right. I've been running the whole map in my head for 4 months, and it's hard to stop." "Stop trying to win the whole thing tonight," he said. "You already ran 4 months and got this far. That's not nothing." She looked down at her hands on the table. The lanolin had helped, but they still looked like they'd been through something, which they had. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "I think about what I should have done differently. At what point I should have just walked away from it, decided it wasn't my problem." "Could you have?" She didn't answer immediately, turned the notebook over once with her fingers. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I could have. I saw what I saw." She looked up. "I know what those payments were connected to. I know people died. I couldn't have just closed the ledger and gone back to my desk." "Then there's nothing to regret about the choice," he said. "Just the consequences." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he still hadn't fully learned to read. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Make things sound simple without actually making them simple." "I don't know what you mean," he said, and stood up and went to stoke the fire. And if that was slightly evasive, it was also true, because he genuinely didn't know what he meant half the time. He just said the thing that seemed real. The fire caught. Outside, the snow had picked back up, coming down steady and dense. The window above the kitchen sink was frosted almost opaque. She checked it anyway. Got up, went to the window, looked through the narrow strip of clear glass at the bottom of the pane. stood there a moment. "Nothing," she said, more to herself than to him. "I know," he said. "I checked the road from the ridge this afternoon. Nothing within 5 miles." She turned. "You check it regularly?" "Since February." He said it without emphasis, like it was obvious, because to him it was. If someone was coming, he wanted to see them coming. So he looked. Something shifted in her expression, not quite the almost smile he'd seen before, something quieter than that. "I didn't know you were doing that," she said. "You didn't need to." He hung the fire iron. "Go sleep. You've been up since before 4. She went. And he sat by the fire for a while, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just listening to the cabin settle and the wind move and the horses shift in the barn. Thinking about a man named Briggs somewhere west of the Missouri. Thinking about the spring thaw and what it would make possible and what it would make dangerous. Thinking about the fact that this woman had been running for 4 months, alone, and had still made it this far, had still gotten the documents out, had still gotten here. That wasn't luck. That was something else. He didn't have a name for it yet. He went to bed. He put the rifle where it had been every night since January. He listened to the snow against the window and the quiet sounds of the cabin holding itself together, and he thought about all of it, and eventually he slept. What woke him at 2:17 in the morning was not a sound from outside. It was a sound from inside, a sharp, single intake of breath from the direction of Rosalind's room, then silence, then the quiet sound of her moving to her window. He lay still and listened. After a minute, she went back to bed. He stared at the ceiling. The rifle was cold against the wall beside him. The fire was down to coals. He didn't know why, but he was almost certain that whatever she'd seen and whatever she dreamed about, it wasn't something that had happened yet. It was something she believed was coming. And the difference between those two things, what had happened and what was coming, felt, in the dark of that cabin, like the thinnest wall he'd ever tried to trust. He stayed awake until the sky started to gray at the edges. Then he got up and fed the horses and started the day. Spring came late that year, which in the mountains meant it came mean. Not the gradual softening that people who'd never lived at altitude imagined, but a violent, lurching thaw that turned the road to mud for 2 weeks and then froze it again overnight and split fence posts with the pressure of water expanding inside the wood. Elias spent most of April fighting it. Rosalind spent most of April learning how to fight it alongside him, which meant she was filthy and exhausted by the end of most days and had stopped apologizing for either. That was something, he thought, that she'd stopped apologizing for being human. She'd settled into the homestead in a way he hadn't predicted. Not comfortably exactly, because comfort wasn't really the word for what either of them had found here, but functionally. She knew where things were. She had opinions about how things should be done, and she stated them plainly, and sometimes she was right, and sometimes she was wrong, and they'd both stopped keeping score. She'd taken over the bookkeeping for the homestead without being asked, simply because she'd noticed the way he tracked expenses in his head and in margin notes in old almanacs, and it had apparently offended something deep in her nature. She'd set up a proper ledger within a week. He didn't comment on it. The numbers were cleaner. What hadn't changed was the night waking, the window checks, the notebook, always within reach, and the thing in her eyes sometimes, late in the evening when she thought he wasn't watching. That low, persistent vigilance, the kind you couldn't turn off even when nothing was wrong, because the part of you responsible for running the alarm had been switched permanently to a hair trigger. He recognized it. He'd seen it in men who'd come back from conflicts they didn't talk about. The body remembering danger even when the mind was trying to move on. He didn't say this to her. It wasn't the kind of thing you said. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday in early May. Elias had ridden into Harlan's Creek for supplies, flour, salt, lamp oil, a new hinge for the cellar door, and while he was loading the wagon outside the general store, Gerald Potts came across the street with the particular walk of a man who had something to say and was working up to saying it. "Had some strangers through yesterday," Potts said, without preamble. He was looking at the wagon, not at Elias, which meant he was being careful. 2 of them came in on the afternoon stage from Pueblo, asked about homesteaders in the area. Elias kept loading. Lots of homesteaders in the area. They weren't asking about lots of them. They were asking about recent ones, new ones. Potts glanced at him sideways. Asked about newcomers specifically. Women, newcomers. Elias set a flour sack in the wagon bed and straightened. What'd you tell them? I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, which is what I'd tell anyone who showed up asking questions they had no business asking. Potts finally looked at him directly. They didn't look like lawmen, dressed like lawmen, but not right. Too clean for field agents, wrong kind of clean. What kind of clean is that? The kind that comes from money, not procedure. Potts rubbed the back of his neck. They had good horses, good equipment, and they paid for their meal in their room with coin, not scrip. A lot of coin. Men on a public salary don't carry that kind of coin. Elias thought about this. They still in town? Left this morning, heading north. Potts paused. There's only one homestead north of here that fits what they were asking about. I appreciate you telling me, Elias said. Potts nodded, looked at the wagon. Your wife settling in all right? She is. Heard she held off a wolf pack while you were out in February. 4 of them, Potts grunted. Sounds like she'll manage. He tipped his hat and went back across the street, and Elias watched him go and then finished loading the wagon and drove home faster than he'd driven anything in recent memory. He told Rosalind before he'd even taken his coat off. She listened with her hands flat on the kitchen table, that posture she had when she was running calculations, when the emotional response was being deliberately held behind the practical one. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Descriptions? She said. Potts said 2 men. Didn't give me much beyond well-dressed and well-funded. It's them, she said. Not panicking, just identifying. Lockwood uses private contractors. They're not affiliated with any formal agency, so they don't have to follow procedure. That's why they travel with coin. No expense reports, no paper trail. How many would he send? At least 2 advance men, possibly more staged further back. She looked at the window, not checking it this time, thinking at it. The advance men scout and confirm. If they confirm the target is here, they signal and the main group comes in. She paused. If they went north this morning and come back with nothing, they might move on. But if anyone in town gave them anything useful, even an offhand comment, they'll be back. Who in town knows you're here? Everyone, she said flatly. We got married in front of witnesses and drove through the main street in broad daylight. Right. He sat down. So we assume they'll be back. We assume they'll be back, she agreed. He thought for a moment. The documents. They should be somewhere besides this cabin. She looked at him. Where? Root cellar, wrapped in oilcloth the way you have them, inside the tin box I use for seed stock, under the false floor panel in the back corner. He watched her expression. You didn't know there was a false floor panel. I did not know there was a false floor panel. Most people don't. Built it for valuables. Never had enough valuables to use it before now. He stood. We do it tonight, before the light's gone. She nodded, then stopped him with a hand on his arm. A first, that. She'd never initiated physical contact before. Elias. She waited until he was looking at her. If they come, these men don't negotiate. They're not here to arrest me or serve papers. They're here to recover the documents and make sure I can't testify to what I know. He held her gaze. I understand what you're telling me. Do you? She wasn't being challenging. She was being precise. Because I need you to understand that this is not a confrontation you can resolve by being reasonable. These are men who have ended situations before, professionally. I know what you're saying, he said. I'm not going to stand in the yard and negotiate with them. She searched his face for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she let go of his arm and stepped back. All right, she said. The root cellar. Tonight. They moved the documents after supper, wrapping them in an extra layer of oilcloth before sealing the tin, and Elias reset the false floor panel and covered it back with seed bags arranged exactly as they'd been. Then he walked the perimeter of the property in the last of the daylight, noting sight lines and approach angles and the specific places where the tree cover on the eastern slope would allow a group of men to reach the property without being visible from the cabin windows. There were 3 such places. He noted all 3. When he came back inside, Rosalind was sitting at the table with her notebook. She wasn't writing in it. She was looking at it. I've been trying to decide, she said without looking up, whether to tell you the rest of it now or wait. He sat down. Tell me now. She opened the notebook to a page near the back. He could see from across the table that it was dense with writing, Names, dates, numbers, connected by lines she'd drawn in pencil. A map of something. There are names in what I copied, she said. Specific names. Men who received payments from Lockwood's accounts and who are identifiable by their roles. She paused. Some of them are public officials. How public? A federal land commissioner. She touched a line on the page. 2 territorial judges. A U.S. Marshal. Not ours. The one based in Pueblo, but still. She looked up. And a senator. One name that appears twice in connection with the largest single payment I found. A payment made 6 weeks before a federal rail route decision that happened to benefit Lockwood's company by several $1,000,000. The kitchen felt smaller than usual. You have documentation connecting a sitting senator to Lockwood's money, Elias said slowly. I have documentation connecting a sitting senator to a payment whose timing and amount are extremely difficult to explain as coincidence. She was precise about it, like she always was. Not overstating, not understating. It's not a confession, but combined with testimony from someone like Briggs, who would have access to the Eastern Ledger records, it becomes very compelling. This is why they want the documents back. This is why they need the documents back. She closed the notebook. Elias, I want you to understand something. If Lockwood's people recover what I have, it doesn't just protect him. It protects every person named in those records, all of them. And those people have their own reasons to make sure this disappears. A senator, he said. A senator has reasons to make sure this disappears. Yes. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the familiar water stain above the rafter that he'd been meaning to fix since fall. He'd never gotten around to it. Funny, the things that didn't get done. So going to the local marshal is out, he said. Going to almost any law enforcement is out, unless I can be certain they're outside Lockwood's network. She was watching him with that careful gray gaze. The only real option is federal authorities who are specifically insulated from political pressure, which is a short list. How do you find them? Carefully. She almost smiled, but it didn't fully form. There's a federal prosecution's office in Denver, not the main one, a secondary office that handles territorial fraud cases. I researched it before I left Chicago. The head of that office has a reputation for pursuing cases that politically connected people would prefer stayed closed. She paused. His name is August Carey. If I can get the documents to Carey, along with testimony from Briggs, he has both the authority and, from what I know of his record, the willingness to pursue it. Denver, Elias said. Denver, she confirmed. They both sat with that for a moment. Denver was 300 miles south through mountain terrain. In May, the passes were nominally open, but nominally was doing a lot of work in that sentence. One problem, he said. More than one, but go ahead. We don't know where Briggs is. No. She set the notebook on the table. But I have a place to start looking. Before he left Lockwood Industries, Briggs filed for a land patent in western Colorado under his own name. I found the filing reference in a ledger cross-entry. Town called Millard Falls. Whether he's still there, I don't know. Millard Falls, he said. That's roughly on the route to Denver, if you stay on the western road. She looked up sharply. You know it? I've been through it twice. Small town, maybe 150 people. Mining settlement originally, turned agricultural when the ore ran out. He thought about it. It's possible. A man trying to disappear after leaving a company like Lockwood's would pick somewhere small and productive, somewhere he could pass as ordinary. That's exactly what Briggs would do. She said it with a certainty that made him think she'd known this man, worked alongside him, understood how he thought. You trust him? Elias asked. She considered it honestly. I trust that he's intelligent and cautious. I trust that he understood what we were both looking at, even if we never discussed it directly. She paused. I don't know if he's brave enough to testify. That's what I don't know. We'd have to convince him. Yes. She met his eyes. I'd have to convince him. He nodded slowly, looked at the window. The real window, not the checking she did. Just looking at the dark beyond the glass, at the slope he'd walked that afternoon, at the eastern tree line he'd mapped in his head. How much time do you think we have? If the advance men went north and found nothing convincing, days, maybe a week. If someone in town said something useful, she stopped. Less. I'll go into town tomorrow, he said, quietly. Talk to Potts. See if those men asked about anything else. See if anyone else spoke to them. He paused. I'll also talk to Frank Crane. He's got a cousin in Pueblo who works the stage lines. If men are moving in and out of the region on Lockwood's money, Frank's cousin might have seen them. She was watching him with an expression he'd seen before, that measuring look, the one she'd had on the platform, but different now, less guarded. You've been thinking about this longer than tonight, she said. Since February, he said. Since the notebook. She was quiet for a moment. I should have told you sooner. You told me when you could. He stood. Get some sleep, real sleep, if you can. I'll try. He started toward his room, stopped. Rosalind? He turned. The senator's name, is it in the notebook? She looked at him steadily. Yes. Don't tell me yet. He said it carefully. If I know the name and they come here and something goes wrong, the less I know, the better for you. She stared at him. Something moved across her face that she didn't immediately control. A flash of something raw, quickly mastered. All right, she said quietly. Not yet. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. He lay in the dark and ran through the geometry of the property in his head, the approaches, the sight lines, the distances. He thought about the root cellar and the tin box and the false floor panel. He thought about a man named August Carey in Denver and a man named Nathaniel Briggs in Millard Falls and a senator whose name he'd decided not to know yet. He thought about a woman who'd stepped off a train in a torn velvet dress, and he thought about how the last 5 months had reorganized things inside him in ways he hadn't given himself permission to examine directly. He didn't examine them directly now either. He just lay in the dark and thought about sight lines and approaches and what he'd do when the men came. Not if, not anymore. When? They came 8 days later. It was early morning, the kind of flat gray light that made distances hard to read, and Elias was in the barn doing the morning feed when Harris started barking. Not the wolf bark. The dog's wolf bark was frantic and high. This was different, low and constant and pointed in one direction, east. Elias came out of the barn slowly with the rifle and stood in the barn doorway where the shadow was deep enough that he'd be hard to see from a distance. He looked at the eastern tree line, counted. 3 horses, 4 men. No, 5. One of the horses was carrying double. They were coming down the slope through the trees, not on the road, which told him 2 things. They'd scouted the property already, and they weren't trying to look official. He went to the cabin. Rosalind was already at the window. She'd heard the dog. How many? She said. 5, coming through the eastern tree line. She moved immediately to her room, back in 15 seconds with the leather bag over her shoulder and her coat half on. The documents are in the cellar. Leave them, he said. If they search the cabin and find nothing, they can't take anything back. The cellar's a better bet than the bag right now. She stopped. Thought it through in about 2 seconds. You're right. She dropped the bag on the table. What's the plan? I'm going to step outside and find out what they want, he said. Officially, they can't just take you. Not in broad daylight with neighbors within shouting distance. Elias, I told you. I know what you told me. He checked the rifle. I'm not negotiating. I'm buying time and establishing that this is my property and my wife and they have no legal authority here. He met her eyes. While I'm doing that, you go out the back door and you go to the Crane's place. You know the way. I'm not leaving you here alone with 5... Rosalind. His voice was level. The documents are what matter. You're what matters. Not the cabin. Not me managing 5 men is a harder problem than 2 of us separately managing 2 problems. You get to the Cranes, Frank has guns, and more importantly, Frank has a horse that can reach the marshal at Ridgeline in 2 hours if it needs to. She stared at him. Her jaw was tight. This isn't a good plan, she said. No, he agreed. It's just the least bad one we've got in the next 4 minutes. She looked at him for one more second. That measuring look, fully open now, nothing held back. And then she said, Don't do anything stupid. I'll try. She went out the back. He gave her 60 seconds to clear the yard. Then he stepped out the front door with the rifle across his arm. Not raised, not threatening, just present. And stood on the porch and waited for the 5 men coming down through his trees to reach his yard. The one in front was tall and unhurried, wearing a coat that cost more than most men in Harlan's Creek made in a month. He had the look of someone who'd done this kind of thing many times and found it tedious rather than difficult. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Elias with flat, professional eyes. "Mr. Crow," he said. Not a question. "That's right," Elias said. "You're on private property." "We're looking for a woman," the man said, "traveling under the name Rosalind Hart. We have reason to believe she's residing here." "My wife's name is Rosalind Crow," Elias said, "and she's not available. We'd like to speak with her." "I'm sure you would." Elias didn't move from the porch. "You got papers? A warrant? Any kind of legal authority I can see?" The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "This doesn't need to be complicated, Mr. Crow. The woman came here with property that doesn't belong to her. We're here to recover it, that's all." "What property would that be?" "Documents, business records." The smile again. "Stolen from her previous employer." "I don't know anything about that," Elias said. "And I'd suggest that if you have a legal claim, you file it through the proper channels. Marshal's office in Ridgeline handles property disputes. I'm happy to let a judge sort it out." Something shifted in the man's expression, the tedium giving way to something less pleasant. He glanced at the men behind him, a small, almost imperceptible signal, and two of them began to move toward the sides of the yard. Elias raised the rifle. Not all the way, just enough. "I wouldn't do that," he said quietly. The two men stopped. The man in the expensive coat looked at Elias with the eyes of someone recalculating, someone who'd expected a simpler problem. "Mr. Crow, you're making a serious mistake." "I make them sometimes," Elias said. "Usually I learn from them. This one I'm comfortable with." He kept his voice even, steady. The way you talk to a horse that was about to bolt, calm, certain, no room for doubt in the sound of it. "Here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to turn around and ride back out the way you came. And then you're going to think carefully about what you do next, because right now you've got nothing. No documents, no witnesses, no confirmation of anything. You ride away today, maybe this whole thing goes a different direction." The man studied him. "And if we don't?" Elias looked at him steadily. "Then we find out how this goes." The yard was absolutely silent except for the wind in the pines and the horses shifting their weight, and Harris, who had stopped barking and was standing rigid at the edge of the porch, watching the men with eyes that were all business. It lasted about 20 seconds. Elias counted them without moving. The man in the expensive coat made a small sound, not quite a laugh. He turned his horse. "This isn't finished," he said over his shoulder. "I didn't think it was," Elias said. He stood on the porch until all 5 horses had disappeared back into the eastern tree line. Then he stood there another 2 minutes because sometimes men turned back. These ones didn't, not yet. He went inside, reloaded the rifle, checked the back door, checked the windows. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet cabin and let his hand shake for about 30 seconds, because they'd been wanting to do that since he'd stepped outside. And then he stopped it and stood up. He had to get to the Crane's place. And then he understood with a cold, clear certainty that sat in his chest like a stone, they had to move. Not in days. Not when the road was better or the timing felt right. They had to move now, while those 5 men were regrouping and deciding what came next, because the man in the expensive coat had the eyes of someone who didn't accept a closed door as an answer. He'd be back, with more men, or a different approach, or both. And the next time, Elias knew, the conversation on the porch was going to be a great deal shorter. Dorothea Crane met him at the door of her farmhouse before he'd even dismounted, which told him she'd seen him coming from the upper window. She had that look on her face, the one she reserved for situations where she was frightened and had decided to be practical about it instead, which on Dorothea meant her mouth was set in a hard line and she was moving with slightly more efficiency than usual. "She's inside," Dorothea said. "She got here 40 minutes ago. Frank's out back with the shotgun watching the east road." "Good man," Elias said, tying Abner to the post. "What happened?" 5 men came to the property. Private contractors, not lawmen. "We need to move today. Right now, ideally." Dorothea absorbed this without visible panic, which was one of the reasons Elias had trusted her with more information than he'd told anyone else in Harlan's Creek. She'd come to the homestead 2 weeks ago, ostensibly to bring a jar of preserved peaches, actually to look at Rosalind with the sharp, measuring eye of a woman who had good instincts about people. And she'd come back the following week and spent 3 hours at the kitchen table and not said a word about it afterward to anyone in town. That kind of discretion was worth more than most things. How far? Dorothea asked. Far enough that staying is worse than going. He went inside. Rosalind was at the Cranes' kitchen table with a mug of something hot she hadn't touched. She was still in her coat. The leather bag was on the table in front of her. She'd gone back for it at some point, which meant she'd gone back to the cabin before coming here, which was either brave or reckless depending on how you looked at it. She looked up when he came in, scanned him for damage, found none. They left, he said. For now, she said. For now, he agreed. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. We need to get the documents from the cellar and go. Today. She nodded, like she'd already reached the same conclusion. Millard Falls first. Millard Falls first, then Denver. He looked at her. It's roughly 240 miles if we take the western route through the passes. This time of year with the roads, we're talking 8 to 10 days minimum, probably more. Can we make it without being followed? Not if we take the main road. He'd been thinking about this on the ride over. There's an older trail, not a road, more of a trapper's route, that runs parallel to the western road about 15 miles into the tree line. It's slower and it's rough, but it's not on any commercial map. Lockwood's men would be looking at stage routes and main roads. You know this trail? I've used sections of it, not the full length, but enough to navigate. He paused. It's not a comfortable way to travel. I stopped being comfortable in October, she said flatly. He almost smiled at that. Didn't quite. Frank Crane came in from the back, nodded at Elias with the particular nod of a man who'd been holding a shotgun in the cold for 40 minutes and was ready for someone to tell him what happened next. Elias told him. Frank listened without interrupting, which was characteristic. When Elias finished, Frank looked at his wife, then back at Elias. I'll ride with you to get the documents from the cellar, Frank said, case they've circled back. I'd appreciate that, Elias said. And then? Then we go. He looked at Rosalind. You need anything from town? I need a better coat, she said. It came out half apologetic, half matter of fact. This one isn't built for what you're describing. Dorothea was already moving toward the back of the house. I have one, she called. Wool-lined canvas. Frank's sister left it here 2 winters ago. Fits someone your size. Rosalind looked at the doorway Dorothea had disappeared through, then back at Elias. Something moved across her face. That raw thing quickly managed. I'll pay her back, she said quietly. She doesn't want to be paid back, he said. Just let her do it. Rosalind pressed her lips together, nodded. They left the Crane farmhouse an hour later with the documents secured in the tin box inside Rosalind's bag, 2 extra horses borrowed from Frank's stable, sturdier mountain animals than the buckskins, which Elias left with Frank for safekeeping, 3 days of provisions, and Dorothea's wool-lined coat, which Rosalind put on without ceremony, and which was, Elias could see, immediately and significantly better than what she'd had. Frank rode with them as far as the eastern cutoff and then turned back. He and Elias shook hands at the junction, and Frank said, You come back with your head attached, and I'll consider it a success, which was the most emotionally generous thing Frank Crane had said to anyone in recent memory. Working on it, Elias said. They took the cutoff into the tree line, and within 20 minutes the main road was gone behind them, swallowed by pine and altitude, and they were alone in the particular silence of deep mountain forest, the kind where the wind didn't reach the ground level, and the only sounds were hooves on soft earth and the distant percussion of water somewhere below them moving fast over rocks. Rosalind rode well, he noticed, better than he'd expected, though by now he'd stopped being surprised when she turned out to be competent at things she hadn't mentioned. She kept her horse at the right distance, read the terrain without being told, and didn't make noise when the trail got steep and the footing went uncertain. They rode most of the first day without speaking much, not the uncomfortable silence of the early weeks, more the focused quiet of 2 people paying attention to the same problem. When they stopped to water the horses at midday on a flat section above a creek, he checked the back trail from a ridge while she refilled the canteens, and when he came back down, she handed him one without looking up. Nothing behind us? She asked. Nothing I can see. Doesn't mean nothing's there, but if they're following, they're doing it very carefully. They're careful men, she said. So are we, he said, which made her look at him with an expression that was partly surprised and partly something else he didn't examine. They made camp that night in a hollow below a granite outcrop that gave them cover on two sides and a clear view of the approach from the south. Elias built the fire small, enough for warmth, not enough to throw light that traveled. She cooked without complaint over a small flame, which he appreciated, because there were people who'd have made a point of how difficult it was, and she wasn't one of them. After they'd eaten, she got out the notebook. "I want to walk you through the full picture," she said. "Everything. Before we get to Briggs, before anything else happens. You should know what we're carrying." He looked at her across the fire. "The senator's name." "Yes. And the rest of it." She opened the notebook to that dense page at the back, the one he'd glimpsed weeks ago, the names and dates and connecting lines. "You said you didn't want to know yet because it was safer. That's still true. But I think the risk of you not knowing now outweighs the risk of you knowing." He thought about the man in the expensive coat, the flat, professional eyes. "Go ahead," he said. She talked for over an hour. All of it. The specific payments, the specific connections, the names. The senator was a man named Harlan Prue, a 3-term incumbent from a state whose congressional boundaries were, according to the documents, partially the result of a federal decision that Lockwood's money had directly influenced. The land commissioner was named Garrett. The judges were 2 men named Stackhouse and Vale. And underneath all of it, the thing that made her voice go carefully flat when she mentioned it, at least 3 men whose deaths, within the time frame covered by the records, coincided with payments to accounts that Rosalind had traced, with considerable effort, to a single fixer who appeared in the ledgers under only a reference number. "You think these were murders," Elias said. "I think the payments suggest that men who stood in opposition to Lockwood's interests died within 6 to 8 weeks of significant transactions," she said precisely. "A jury could draw its own conclusions." The fire popped. Somewhere down the slope a nightbird called once and then went quiet. "Why didn't you go straight to the federal office in Denver when you first ran?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. 4 months ago. "Why the long route?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I had documents and no corroboration, and I was terrified that if I walked into the wrong office at the wrong time, if Lockwood had people inside the federal system, which the records suggest he does, I'd be handing him the only copies of the evidence and making it very easy to make me disappear quietly." She paused. "I needed time to identify who was clean. Carey's name took me 3 months to find through secondary sources, people who'd worked adjacent to his cases, his reputation for not settling, and Briggs. Briggs is the difference between a strong case and an overwhelming one. Carey can work with what I have, but with Briggs's Eastern records," she shook her head, "it becomes something that can't be buried, even with political pressure. You need redundancy, multiple sources, multiple witnesses. Otherwise they dismantle it piece by piece and call it circumstantial." He nodded slowly. "You planned all of this while you were running." "I planned it while I was working before I ran and kept adjusting it while running." She looked at him. "It's what I do. I see the ledger. I see where things need to balance." A pause. "I just never planned on ending up in Colorado married to a homesteader." "Did you have a plan for that part?" "My plan for that part was to survive long enough to not need a plan for that part." She said it without self-pity, just honest accounting. He looked at the fire. "It's not the worst place to have ended up." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." They slept in shifts. He took the first watch, and she took the second. And when she woke him at what he estimated was 3 in the morning, she said, "Quiet out there," in a voice that was professionally steady despite the fact that she'd clearly been running on about 4 hours of sleep for the last several days. And he thought that was a particular kind of toughness that had nothing to do with the physical. The second day on the trail was harder. The terrain rose sharply through a section he'd navigated twice before, but not recently, and one of the horses threw a shoe on a rocky descent, and they lost 2 hours finding a section of flat ground safe enough to work on. And by the time Elias had improvised a temporary fix from spare materials in the saddlebag, the light was already going gray and cold at the edges. "How much further to Millard Falls?" Rosalind asked, watching him work. "At this pace, 2 more days." He didn't look up from the hoof. "Maybe 2.5. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think they've circled around to the main road, trying to get ahead of us?" "Probably." He set the hoof down, straightened. which is why we're not on the main road. If they know about Briggs, do they? She thought about it. I don't think so. The connection between my records and his is something you'd only see if you understood both ledgers. Lockwood's people recovered everything in my office when they searched it, but the cross-reference to Briggs's work is subtle. It's in how the account numbers pattern, not in any explicit notation. So they're following you, not going ahead to Briggs? I believe so, yes. Then we're still all right, he said. Stay on this trail, stay off the main road. We get to Millard Falls before anyone knows to look there. She nodded. Then, Elias. He was packing the tools back into the saddlebag. He stopped. When this is over, she said carefully, when we get to Denver and Carrie has what he needs, I don't know what happens after that. For me, I've been so focused on the getting there that I haven't thought much about the after. She paused. I want you to know that I'm aware you didn't. This arrangement wasn't supposed to be what it became. I don't have expectations about... Stop, he said. She stopped. One problem at a time, he said. It came out a little rougher than intended. We get to Denver. That's the problem right now. The after is the after. She looked at him for a moment with that open, unguarded expression, the one she'd been letting him see more of over these last weeks, the one without the professional distance she'd built around herself like a second coat. All right, she said quietly. They pushed on. Millard Falls announced itself on the afternoon of the third day as a scatter of wood-frame buildings tucked into a valley where two creek branches came together, surrounded by the kind of agricultural earnestness that came from people who'd tried mining, failed at it, and decided to try something harder and more honest. Elias counted maybe 40 structures visible from the ridge above. A main street, a few dozen homesteads spreading out from it, a mill on the north branch of the creek that was clearly the town's primary economic function. How do we find him without drawing attention? Rosalind asked, looking down at the town. Carefully, he said. You stay with the horses up here. I go down, ask around the feed store or the mill. Men who've been working here a while know everyone. I don't use his name directly. What do you use? I ask about accountants, men who do books for local businesses. In a town this size, if there's someone doing that work, there's one person everyone uses. He looked at her. If it's Briggs, you'll know him by my description when I come back. She agreed, clearly not loving it, but understanding the logic. He left her with the horses in a stand of aspens on the ridge and rode down into Millard Falls alone. And he was at the mill within 20 minutes talking to a foreman named Cass, who had the open, unguarded manner of a man who had no particular reason to be suspicious of anyone. Books? Cass said. Yeah, we got a fella does books for half the businesses in town. Moved here about a year and a half ago. Quiet type. Good with numbers. Lord, the man is good with numbers. Name's Aldridge. Thomas Aldridge. Elias described the man as Rosalind had described him. Late 40s, slight build, probably wore spectacles. Probably had the indoor pallor of a man who'd spent most of his life at a desk. Cass nodded immediately. That's Thomas. Works out of the back of the hardware store. You looking to have something done? Just need a consultation, Elias said. He found the hardware store without difficulty and the back room without much more. And when he knocked and opened the door, he found a slight man in his late 40s, wearing spectacles, sitting at a desk covered in ledgers, who looked up with the expression of someone who had gotten very good at looking like he expected nothing unusual and found this particular arrival unusual anyway. The man's eyes went to Elias, then to the door behind him, then back to Elias. Fast. Practiced. Thomas Aldridge, Elias said. The man was very still. That's right. My name is Elias Crow. I have someone with me who knew you when your name was Nathaniel Briggs. The color left the man's face in about 2 seconds. He stood up slowly from behind the desk, and Elias could see him calculating. The door, the window, the distance to each, the probability of various outcomes. Sit down, Elias said, not unkindly. I'm not here to bring you trouble. I'm here because the woman who got out of Chicago 4 months ago with everything she could carry is on a ridge above your town right now, and she needs your help. Briggs, Aldridge, sat down slowly. His hands were flat on the desk. The knuckles were white. Rosalind, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she got out. He said it in a tone that mixed relief with something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. I heard there were people looking. I thought, she got out, Elias said. She's been running for 4 months. She has the Western records. She needs you to tell her you have the Eastern ones and that you'll testify. Briggs took his spectacles off and set them on the desk and rubbed his eyes with both hands. It was a gesture of pure, exhausted humanity. The gesture of a man who had been waiting for a particular knock on a particular door for over a year and was now reckoning with the fact that it had arrived. I have the records, he said. His voice was muffled behind his hands. All right. I've had them since before I left. I didn't know if they were enough without what she had from the Western Division. He lowered his hands, put his spectacles back on. Together? Together it's enough to bury him, Elias said. According to Rosalind, and she's not someone who overstates. Briggs looked at the ledgers on his desk, at the small, orderly life he'd built in this back room of a hardware store in a town nobody was looking at the window, through which you could see the creek and the mill and 40 structures full of people who thought his name was Thomas Aldridge. If I testify, he said, this is over. All of it. This, he gestured at the room. Everything I've built here. Your real name is Nathaniel Briggs, Elias said. You can't build a real life on top of a false one indefinitely. You know that. Briggs was quiet for a long time. The creek was audible through the window, fast with spring runoff, constant and indifferent. I'll need time to You have tonight, Elias said. We leave for Denver tomorrow morning, early. Briggs looked at him. You're not a patient man, are you, Mr. Crow? I'm patient about most things, Elias said. The men who've been following my wife for 4 months are not particularly patient, and they're somewhere behind us on a road that's getting shorter every day. Briggs absorbed this. Something settled in his face. Not peace exactly, but the particular resolution of a man who has run the numbers and found only one answer worth living with. Tell her. He stopped. Tried again. Tell Rosalind I have the Eastern ledgers, all of them. Tell her I'm sorry it took this long. Tell her yourself, Elias said. Come up to the ridge. He came. When Rosalind saw him come through the aspens with Elias, something happened in her face that she didn't try to control. A brief, complete collapse of the professional composure. A flash of pure relief so genuine it was almost painful to witness. She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and grabbed his arm with both hands and said, Nathaniel, in a voice that was about 6 months of running and hiding compressed into 3 syllables. Briggs put his hand over hers and said, I know. I'm sorry. I'm here. And he looked like he meant every word of it. Elias looked away at the valley below, giving them a moment. The sun was going down behind the western peaks, turning the snow up high a shade of orange that had no name he knew. The creek caught it and threw it back in pieces. They camped above Millard Falls that night, 3 of them now, and Briggs, who had brought a saddlebag with his copies of the Eastern ledgers wrapped in the same kind of oilcloth Rosalind had used, as if they'd independently reached the same conclusion about how to protect the same truth, sat across the fire from Rosalind and they talked in low, rapid voices for 2 hours, going through documents and cross-referencing accounts and building the architecture of something that would matter. Elias kept watch. He didn't follow all of what they said. The accounting language was its own dialect, but he understood the shape of it. They were assembling the case. Piece by piece, Eastern records meeting Western records, the whole picture emerging from what had been 2 incomplete halves. Around midnight, Rosalind looked up from the papers spread between them and found Elias watching the southern approach. It's enough, she said. Her voice was quiet and certain. Together, it's enough. He looked at her. Then we get to Denver. She nodded. Then she looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to, in a way that said something she didn't put into words, and he didn't ask her to because the fire was warm and the night was clear, and some things didn't need to be said to be understood. What woke all 3 of them 2 hours before dawn was not a sound from the trail. It was the smell. Smoke, not campfire smoke, the dense structural smell of a building burning. Elias was on his feet before his brain had fully caught up, and he was looking south, toward Millard Falls, where an orange glow was climbing above the tree line with a steadiness that meant it was not small and it was not accidental. The hardware store, Briggs said. He'd gone pale. My records. I took everything I had with me, but my rooms are above the store and there are other documents. They found you, Rosalind said. She was already on her feet, her bag over her shoulder, the documents secure. Her voice was flat and certain. They came around on the main road. They found you first and they're burning the connection. Elias was already moving to the horses. We go now, not at dawn. Now. In the dark? Briggs said. I know this trail well enough. He didn't, fully, but he knew it better than men who'd just arrived from the main road, and that would have to be sufficient. Get your horse. They rode hard through the dark, 3 of them in a line, Elias in front reading the trail by starlight and memory, and the particular instinct that came from years of moving through mountain terrain at hours when visibility was unreliable. Twice he slowed them to a walk through sections where the footing was uncertain. Once he stopped entirely, certain he heard horses behind them, and they all sat absolutely still in the dark for 3 full minutes before he decided the sound was water and pushed on. Behind them, the glow above Millard Falls stayed in the sky for another hour before it faded. When the first gray light started building in the east, Rosalind pulled her horse alongside his. How far to Denver? She asked. 5 days if we push. 6 if we're careful. We push, she said. I know, he said. They pushed. And somewhere behind them, on roads they weren't using, men with expensive coats and flat professional eyes were doing the same calculation. Figuring the distances, figuring the routes, figuring out how much time they had left to stop what was coming before it became unstoppable. The mountains were indifferent to all of it, as they always were. But the people moving through them were not. They rode into Denver on the 6th day, which was 1 day longer than Elias had promised, and 2 days shorter than any reasonable person would have expected given what the last 48 hours had looked like. The final stretch had been the worst of it. 2 days out from Denver, on a section of trail where the western route finally rejoined the main road, they'd been spotted. Not by the man in the expensive coat, someone else. A single rider who'd been watching the road junction with the particular patience of a man being paid to wait. He'd seen them and turned his horse south before Elias could do anything about it. And after that, it had been a question of speed and nerve, and how well 3 tired people on horses that needed rest could stay ahead of men who were riding fresh animals on a road they knew better. The answer was, barely. They'd pushed through the last night without stopping, trading off dozing in the saddle in a way that was deeply uncomfortable and only marginally effective. And Briggs, who had not been on a horse for any serious purpose in at least a decade, had gone so quiet by the final hours that Rosalind had ridden alongside him for miles, just to make sure he was still conscious and moving forward. He was. He was also, Elias suspected, running on something purer than physical endurance by that point. The same thing Rosalind had been running on for 6 months. The particular fuel that came from having made a decision you couldn't unmake and deciding to see it through regardless of the cost. Denver came out of the gray morning like something being assembled piece by piece. First the smell of coal smoke and livestock, then the distant sound of a city doing its morning business, then the actual physical fact of buildings and streets, and people going about their lives in the ordinary way that people went about their lives when they didn't know what was moving through the edges of their city. The federal building is on Larimer Street, Rosalind said. Her voice was hoarse. She hadn't said much in the last several hours. Secondary annex, 3rd floor. You've been here before, Elias said. I rode through once, before Harlan's Creek. She looked at him. I needed to know where it was. In case. 4 months of in case. He thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train in January with 1 bag and a bruise, and her eyes already moving before her feet were on the ground. And he thought about all the preparation that had preceded even that moment. The months of working while afraid, copying while appearing calm, running while planning the next step of the run. The level of sustained, careful courage that required was something he hadn't fully reckoned with until this moment. Watching her ride through the early morning streets of Denver, with her back straight and her eyes forward, and her hand resting on the bag that held everything she'd carried for 6 months. She wasn't fearless. He knew that. He'd heard her wake up at night for months. He'd seen the shaking in her hands after the wolves. He'd watched her sit at the kitchen table with the notebook and do the math on her own survival over and over, because doing the math was how she managed the fear, by converting it into a problem she could solve. That wasn't fearlessness. It was something harder. They reached the federal building at 7:40 in the morning. It was a solid brick structure, 3 stories, unremarkable except for the territorial seal above the main entrance. And Elias thought about the fact that every important moment seemed to happen in unremarkable buildings, and he left that thought where it was. He tied the horses himself while Rosalind helped Briggs down. The man's legs were genuinely unsteady after 6 days in the saddle with minimal rest, and he grabbed the hitching post for a moment and breathed through it with his eyes closed. "You all right?" she asked. "I've been better," he said honestly. "I've also been worse." He opened his eyes, straightened, adjusted his spectacles. "Let's go." The clerk on the ground floor was a young man who looked like he'd been in this job approximately 3 weeks and was still deciding whether he liked it. He looked at the 3 of them, road-worn, exhausted, Elias still carrying the rifle across his arm from force of habit, with the particular expression of a young man confronting something outside his training. "We need to see August Carey," Rosalind said. She put both hands on the counter and looked at the clerk directly. "My name is Rosalind Crowe, formerly Rosalind Hart. I have evidence of federal fraud, bribery, and connected violent crimes involving Vincent Lockwood and multiple public officials, including a sitting senator. The evidence is documented and corroborated by a second witness present here." She paused. "Please tell Mr. Carey that we've traveled a considerable distance and that the men who've been trying to stop us from getting here are approximately 2 days behind us." The clerk stared at her. "Now would be good," she said. He went upstairs quickly. August Carey came down himself rather than sending someone, which told Elias something about the man before he said a word. He was in his 50s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that had reached a settled equilibrium somewhere between kind and immovable. He looked at the 3 of them with the eyes of a man who had spent a career reading situations quickly. "Mrs. Crowe," he said. "Mr. Carey?" She held out her hand and he shook it. "I have the Western Ledger records from Lockwood Industries accounts, copied over approximately 3 months prior to my departure from Chicago. I also have—" She turned slightly toward Briggs. "Nathaniel Briggs, former accounts manager for Lockwood's Eastern Division. He has the Eastern records." Carey looked at Briggs. "Mr. Briggs?" "What she said," Briggs said. He sounded exhausted and faintly wry about it. "All of it." Carey looked at Elias. "Her husband," Elias said. "I just got them here." Carey almost smiled. "Come upstairs," he said. They went upstairs. What followed was the longest single day of Elias Crowe's life, which was saying something given the competition of the last 6 months. Carey had 2 associates, a younger attorney named Marsh and a woman named Fisk, who appeared to hold some analytical role that was never fully explained. And the 5 of them sat in a room that smelled of paper and old wood, while Rosalind and Briggs went through the documents methodically, cross-referencing the Western and Eastern records, and walking Carey and his people through the structure of what they'd found. Elias sat in a chair by the window and mostly didn't speak, which was fine because nobody needed him to. He watched Rosalind work. She'd been awake for over 30 hours at that point, and she was still precise, still choosing every word carefully, still catching Briggs when he overstated something and pulling it back to what the documents actually showed versus what they implied. "You can't claim the payments prove murder directly," she said at one point, correcting something Briggs had said to Marsh. "What you can demonstrate is the timing pattern and the payment amounts in relation to specific events. The inference is compelling, but you have to let the evidence make the inference. If we overreach, they'll tear it apart." Marsh looked at her. "How long were you an accounts manager?" 3 years, she said. "Have you considered law?" She looked tired enough that she almost laughed. One catastrophe at a time. By mid-afternoon, Carey had read enough to call for a colleague from the main federal office across the city, a man named Harwood, who arrived with 2 assistants and spent an hour with the documents before coming out of the inner room with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally the expression of a man who had just seen something significant. "We'll need to move quickly on the evidentiary filing," Harwood said to Carey, "before any of the named parties can—" "I'm aware," Carey said. He looked at Rosalind. "We'll need both of you available for formal statements over the next several days, and we'll need to arrange protection." "Protection," Briggs said. He said it the way a man said a word he'd been waiting a long time to hear. "There are men from Lockwood," Elias said, "private contractors. They were behind us on the road. They know we came to Denver." Carey nodded. "Fisk," he said without turning around. Fisk was already writing something. I'll coordinate with the city marshal's office, she said. People I know are clean. Carrie looked at Elias. You said they were 2 days behind you. That was a guess, Elias said honestly. Could be less. Then we have tonight to get the filing secured. He turned back to his desk. No one leaves this building until we have federal protection in place. I'll arrange rooms. He paused, and something shifted in his manner. Just slightly, enough to be human. You did well to get here, he said, directed at Rosalind, at Briggs, at both of them. I mean that. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. 6 months of running had left her features with a kind of permanent guardedness, a waiting quality, the look of someone who'd learned not to believe in safe until safe had proven itself over time. We'll see, she said. But thank you. They stayed in the federal building that night, in 2 small rooms on the 2nd floor that smelled of old carpet and were the most secure rooms Elias had slept in since January. He didn't sleep well anyway. He lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of a city at night, so different from the mountain sounds he'd spent months calibrating to, all the human noise and the horses and the distant bell of something, and thought about the property 7 miles outside Harlan's Creek with the Ponderosa windbreak and the root cellar and the false floor panel that still had the empty tin box in it, thought about the east barn wall that Rosalind had told him how to fix, thought about the biscuits she'd burned her first week and then figured out. In the morning, Fisk informed them that 2 men matching the description of Lockwood's contractors had been observed at a hotel 2 blocks from the federal building and had been taken into custody by city marshal's deputies at 5 a.m. Not the man in the expensive coat, 2 others, scouts, the advanced layer of the operation. Their detention wouldn't hold indefinitely, Fisk said, but it didn't need to. The evidentiary filing had been completed at 11 the previous night. The documents were no longer just documents. They were federal evidence. What happened after that moved faster than Elias had expected and slower than Rosalind had hoped, which she told him was exactly how legal processes worked and why she'd built redundancy into every part of the plan. The investigation didn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It assembled itself, piece by piece, in the way that real processes assembled themselves, with delays and setbacks and moments where nothing seemed to be moving and then sudden lurches forward. Within 2 weeks of the filing, a federal judge had issued protective orders covering both Rosalind and Briggs as material witnesses. Within a month, the first subpoenas had gone out, to Lockwood Industries' primary offices, to the financial institutions that had handled the flagged accounts, to 3 individuals whose names appeared in the records, and who each, upon receiving the subpoena, apparently decided that their own legal exposure was more concerning than their loyalty to Lockwood. That last part, Rosalind explained to Elias, was how these things actually collapsed. Not from the top down, but from the edges in. People who'd been beneficiaries of a corrupt system held together when the system looked invincible and began looking for exits the moment it started to crack. Land Commissioner Garrett resigned first, then Judge Stackhouse. A week after that, executives from Lockwood Industries' Chicago office began providing information to federal investigators in exchange for reduced exposure, and each one of them provided a little more than the last, like a structure dismantling itself from the inside because everyone inside it had decided that self-preservation mattered more than solidarity. Senator Harlan Prue attempted to distance himself from Lockwood publicly, then quietly, then desperately, in a progression that Rosalind followed through newspaper accounts with the focused attention of someone who had spent months memorizing every name in those records and was now watching those names become consequences. Vincent Lockwood himself was indicted 8 weeks after the initial filing. The formal charges covered fraud, bribery of public officials, obstruction of federal proceedings, and 4 counts of conspiracy connected to the deaths that Rosalind had identified in the payment records. He was a man who had built an empire on the assumption that enough money spread in the right directions created a kind of permanent insulation from accountability. He was wrong. He'd been wrong from the moment Rosalind Hart had stayed late at her desk one evening and started cross-referencing accounts and couldn't make herself stop. That was the thing, Elias thought, when he read the account of the indictment in a Denver newspaper 2 months after they had arrived at the federal building. The whole machinery, the judges, the politicians, the private contractors, the years of accumulated corruption, had been undone not by a federal investigation or a grand jury or an act of institutional virtue. It had been undone by one woman who noticed something wrong and couldn't close the ledger. He thought about that for a while, sitting on the steps of the boarding house where they'd been staying in Denver during the proceedings. The city was fully into summer by then, dry and warm, smelling of dust and commerce. Rosalind came and sat beside him, and he handed her the newspaper, and she read the account of the indictment quietly, all the way through, and then folded it and set it on the step beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Briggs all right?" Elias asked. Briggs had given his formal testimony 2 weeks prior and had spent the following week in a state of shattered relief that he was slowly, carefully rebuilding into something functional. "He's talking to Carrie's office about what comes next," she said. "There's a federal witness assistance arrangement being discussed. A clean start somewhere." She paused. "He told me he's been thinking about going back to his real name." "Good," Elias said. She leaned her elbows on her knees and looked at the street. People walked past with the ordinary urgency of people going places that didn't involve any of this. A wagon went by carrying lumber. 2 women with shopping baskets argued mildly about something. A dog trotted past with the self-satisfied air of a dog who knew exactly where it was going. "I've been thinking," she said. "All right, about what comes next." She turned to look at him. Her face had changed over these months. Not dramatically, not in any specific feature, but in the quality of it. The waiting had gone out of it, mostly. The permanent low-level alertness that had lived in her eyes since the platform in January had settled into something calmer, not careless. She'd never be careless. It wasn't in the architecture of how she was built, but rested. Finally, actually rested. "Carrie asked me to stay on as a consultant," she said, "for the ongoing proceedings. My knowledge of the account structures would be useful during the trial." "That makes sense," he said carefully. "I told him I'd think about it." She looked back at the street. "I also told him I couldn't give him an answer until I talked to you." He looked at her. "That's the first time you've said that." "Said what?" "That you needed to talk to me before making a decision." She considered this. "I suppose it is." A pause. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "It isn't." She was quiet for a moment. The lumber wagon had disappeared around the corner. The dog was gone. The 2 women with baskets were still visible in the distance, the argument apparently resolved in favor of one of them. "I don't know how to do this," she said. It came out plain without performance. "I'm good at accounting. I'm good at running. I'm apparently passable with a shotgun." A pause. "I don't have a lot of practice at the rest of it." "Neither do I," he said, in case that wasn't obvious. She looked at him. It was a little obvious. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. It had been a while since he'd made that sound. It felt unfamiliar in a way that was not unpleasant. "The homestead," she said. "The cabin is gone." "Most of it," he said. "The root cellar's probably intact. The barn structure might be salvageable. The land is the land. Nobody burned that." She was quiet for a moment. "It would need to be rebuilt." "From close to scratch," he agreed. "It would be a significant amount of work. Months, probably." "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to come back?" He met her eyes. "I'm saying the land is there and the root cellar is probably intact, and the east barn wall would hold better with the diagonal brace you figured out. I'm saying the cranes are 7 miles away, and Potts is still running the station, and the Ponderosas are still standing." He paused. "And I'm saying I'd rather build it back with you than without you. But that's a thing you should choose, not a thing I should tell you." She looked at him for a long time. The street continued its ordinary business around them. Somewhere behind them, inside the boarding house, a clock ticked. "The consultancy for Carrie," she said finally. "It would take most of the fall, if I did it." "Fall's not a bad time to plan a rebuild," he said. "You can't break ground until spring anyway. You'd wait." "I'd go back and start on what can be started," he said, "and wait for the rest." He looked at her. "If that's what you decide." She held his gaze. Then she exhaled. A long, slow exhale. The kind that released something carried a long time. "I'm going to tell Carrie yes," she said quietly, "and then I'm going to come back." He nodded. "All right." "I mean it," she said. I'm not running anymore. I know where I'm going." "I know," he said. "I believe you." She looked at the folded newspaper on the step between them, at Lockwood's name in the headline. 6 months ago, that name had been a threat so large it had swallowed her entire life. Now it was newsprint. Now it was a legal proceeding working its way through a system. Now it was, slowly and imperfectly, and with all the frustrating uncertainty of real accountability, becoming a consequence. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the moment I didn't go back to my office, when I saw the men searching my desk and I just kept walking." She shook her head slightly. "It didn't feel like courage. It felt like my feet knew something my brain was still catching up to." "Most decisions work that way," he said. "The good ones, anyway." "If I'd gone back in," she said, "if I'd tried to explain or confront it or pretend I hadn't seen—" "You didn't," he said. "No." She was quiet. "And you didn't send me back. On the platform. You could have—" "The situation was already strange. I was clearly not what you'd arranged for, and you could have just put me back on the train." "That's not how I operate," he said. It was almost word for word what he'd said that first night in January, on the wagon, 7 miles from home. She remembered. He could tell she remembered. "I know," she said. "I know that now." She picked up the newspaper and held it for a moment. "I want you to know something. What you did, staying on that porch, holding those 5 men back long enough for me to get to the cranes." She stopped, pressed forward. "I've thought about it a lot. I think about it more than I've told you. You made the choice that mattered when it mattered, without having all the information, without knowing if it was going to work." She looked at him directly. "That's not a small thing." He looked at the street, a habit he had, when things came close enough to be uncomfortable. "You'd have found another way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to." They sat in the summer sun on the steps of the boarding house for a while longer, not saying much else, which was fine. They'd never needed to fill silences with noise. It had been one of the first things that worked between them, back in the wagon on that January night with the blizzard coming down. The ability to be in a silence together without it being a problem. That, Elias thought, was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. He went back to Harlan's Creek in September. The ride home was different from every other ride he'd taken. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of noise and everything to do with the absence of urgency. Nobody was following him. He wasn't scouting approaches or watching for riders or calculating sight lines. He was just a man going home through mountains that were starting their fall turn, the aspens going gold in the high places, the air carrying that particular sharpness that meant the seasons had made their decision. The homestead was what he'd expected, which was worse than it looked from a distance and better than it could have been. The cabin was a partial ruin. The fire had taken the roof and the north wall and damaged the east side significantly, but the fireplace and the root cellar and the foundational structure were intact, which was more than nothing. The barn had survived better. Lockwood's men had apparently been more focused on the cabin. The root cellar was exactly as he'd left it, the tin box and the false floor panel undisturbed and now empty. The cranes came by the second day and helped him take inventory of what could be salvaged and what needed to come down. Dorothea walked through the ruin of the main room without saying much, and then came out and said very practically, "The fireplace is solid. That's the hardest part. Everything else is just work." Frank looked at the east barn wall and said, "Leans." "Getting fixed," Elias said. He worked through September and October. The rebuild was slow and physical and satisfying in the way that concrete problems were satisfying when you had the skill to address them. You could see the progress each day, which was more than you could say for most of the things that actually mattered. Frank came on weekends. 2 men from town, Garrett and a younger man named Cole, who'd lost his claim the previous spring and was looking for work, came during the week. By the end of October, the new roof was on, and 2 of the 4 walls were complete, and the east barn wall was braced correctly, exactly as Rosalind had described on that piece of paper months ago. He put the paper in the tin box in the root cellar. He wasn't sure why. It seemed like the kind of thing worth keeping. She came back in the second week of November, which was earlier than he'd expected. He was splitting wood in the yard when he heard a horse on the road and looked up and saw her coming around the tree line on a gray mare he didn't recognize. She'd arranged her own transportation back, which he should have expected and didn't entirely. She stopped the horse at the edge of the yard and looked at the cabin, the new walls, the new roof, the repaired barn beyond it, with an expression that moved through surprise into something that wasn't surprise, but looked adjacent to it. "You got the roof on," she said. "November's not great for roofing," he said. "Better to have it done." She looked at the east barn wall. "You did the brace." "You were right about where it was failing," he said. "Didn't see a reason to leave it wrong." She dismounted. The gray mare stood quietly while she tied it to the post, and she crossed the yard and stood in front of him with the particular directness she'd had since the beginning. Since the platform, since the first morning in the cabin, since all of it. "I testified," she said. "Carrie's case is solid. Prue's attorney is negotiating a plea. Lockwood's trial is set for spring." She paused. "Briggs went back to his real name. He's in Kansas City. He sounds like himself for the first time in a year and a half." "Good," Elias said. She looked around the yard again. At the ponderosas along the slope, carrying their first dusting of early snow. At the cabin, imperfect and incomplete but standing. At the two dogs, who had apparently decided she was allowed on the property because Harris walked up and put his nose on her hand and she scratched his ears without looking down. "It needs a new kitchen window," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been avoiding it." "Why?" "Glazier in town charges too much." She almost laughed. Fully this time. It came all the way out, unguarded, and it sounded like something that had been waiting for the right moment. "I'll do the numbers on it," she said. "I figured you would," he said. They went inside. The fire was already going as though he'd stoked it before going out to split wood, and the new walls smelled of fresh pine, which was not an unpleasant smell in November. The kitchen was functional but incomplete. The main room was better. The back rooms were solid. She set her bag on the table. Not the leather traveling bag, a different one, larger, with more in it. She'd brought more this time. He noticed that and filed it where he filed things that didn't need to be said. "Elias," she said. He was hanging his coat. "I want to say something, and then I don't want to talk about it again because if I think about it too long, I'll start managing it like an accounting problem, and it'll come out wrong." He turned, waited. "I don't know what I expected when I got on that train," she said. "I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't expecting you." She held his gaze with the full, direct steadiness that was one of the things that was entirely and specifically her. "But I stopped running. And this is where I stopped. And I know, that's not an accident." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The kitchen window. I'll get the glazier in next week." She stared at him. "That's your response?" "You said you didn't want to talk about it," he said. "I'm not talking about it. I'm telling you the window's getting fixed." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, her seat, the one she'd always taken, and something settled in her that he could see from across the room. "Fine," she said. "Get the glazier." "I will," he said. Outside, the snow came down in the way it did in November. Not the violent commitment of January, but tentatively, as if deciding whether this was the right time. The ponderosas held it on their branches for a while before letting it fall. The horses in the barn shifted and settled. Harris and Clementine arranged themselves near the fire with the professional certainty of dogs who understood their situation completely. The rebuilt cabin held the warmth the way the original had. Not perfectly, with drafts around the new window frame that would need attention, and a section of floor near the north wall that still needed insulation before deep winter. Imperfect, unfinished, standing. There was, Elias thought, something honest about a place you could see the work in. Something that told the truth about what it cost to build a thing and keep it standing. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without being asked. She wrapped both hands around it the way she always had, since the first morning in the first kitchen, and looked at the fire. He sat down across from her. The snow kept falling outside, indifferent and ordinary, the way snow fell on everything, on the ruins of burned buildings and the foundations of new ones, on the tracks of men who'd come with bad intentions, and the tracks of those who'd outrun them, on a country that was large enough to swallow all of it and go on without noticing. But inside the cabin, the fire burned, and 2 people sat across from each other at a kitchen table in the particular quiet of people who had no more running to do. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.